The sound of shattering porcelain was a gunshot in the silent house. 7-year-old Sophia stood frozen, a small statue of terror amidst the glittering shards of a teacup on the kitchen floor. Her stepmother, Raquel, didn't yell. The silence that followed was far worse, a cold, heavy blanket that suffocated the air. Sophia's gaze darted from the broken cup to Raquel's face, a mask of controlled fury. Her eyes, usually just distant, were now sharp points of ice. The little girl's hands trembled, not from the accident, but from the chilling certainty of what was to come. She had seen this look before, a prelude to a storm of words that felt like stones. In that moment, the entire world shrank to the space between them, a battlefield where she was already defeated. Raquel moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was more menacing than any sudden outburst. She knelt, not to comfort, but to bring her face level with Sophia's. "You are just like her," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss, careless, a constant reminder of what I can never have. Each word was a precise, calculated strike against the memory of Sophia's mother. "You are a burden, a little ghost that haunts these halls. Everything you touch, you break." Sophia's breath caught in her throat, her large, expressive eyes filling with tears she fought to hold back. She wanted to say it wasn't true, that she wasn't bad. But the words were trapped behind a wall of fear. Can a child understand such deep-seated jealousy? Or do they simply absorb the poison as their own truth? Without another word, Raquel stood up, her decision made. She grabbed Sophia's small wrist, her grip like iron, and pulled her from the kitchen. The girl stumbled, her bare feet cold on the polished wood floors. She didn't resist. She had learned long ago that resistance only made it worse. Raquel dragged her to her bedroom and pushed her inside. The room was sparse, stripped of warmth and personality, more of a cell than a child's sanctuary. "You will stay here," Raquel commanded, her voice flat and final. "I don't want to see your face." The door clicked shut, a sound of absolute finality, and the lock turned from the outside. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by a sliver of light under the door, a cruel reminder of the world she was locked away from. Alone in the cold and the dark, Sophia slid down the door, her small body curling into a ball on the floor. The tears finally came, but they were silent, tracking clean paths down her dusty cheeks. She didn't sob or scream. Her grief was a quiet, internal thing, a weight pressing down on her chest. Her tiny fingers clutched the hem of her dress, twisting the fabric as her stepmother's words echoed in her mind. Burden, ghost, bad. She believed them. In the simple, heartbreaking logic of a child, if the person who was supposed to be her mother didn't love her, the fault had to be hers. What else could it be? Have you ever felt a pain so deep you thought it was a part of you? For Sophia, that pain was now her only companion. The hours bled into one another. The sliver of light under the door vanished as the house settled into the profound silence of night. Sophia didn't move. She listened to the distant sounds of a life she wasn't part of, the faint murmur of the television, the clink of silverware as her father and Raquel had dinner, the closing of their bedroom door. She was an island of forgotten sorrow in her own home. She hugged her knees tighter, a fragile shield against the immense loneliness that filled the room. Air cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her stomach ached with hunger, but it was the hunger in her heart that was truly unbearable. She only wanted to be loved. Was that too much to ask? To understand Raquel, you must first understand the silence she walked into. She married Marcos not for his money, but for the quiet strength she saw in his eyes, mistaking his grief for depth. She dreamt of filling his silent house with laughter, of building a new life from the ashes of his old one. But the house was not empty. It was haunted. Haunted by the ghost of a woman she had never met, whose photograph still sat on the mantelpiece, whose favorite books lined the shelves, whose presence lingered in every room like a faint perfume. Raquel tried to scrub it clean, to replace the old memories with new ones, but she was painting over a masterpiece with watercolors. Was she wrong to want a home that felt like her own? The ghost had a name, and it looked exactly like Sophia. The girl was a perfect, miniature copy of her mother, the same expressive eyes, the same way her hair curled behind her ears. Every time Raquel looked at the child, she wasn't seeing a little girl who needed a mother. She was seeing a rival, a constant, living reminder that she was the second choice. Sophia's innocent laughter sounded like an echo of another woman's joy, Her simple requests for affection felt like demands for a love Raquel could never truly own. The child became a mirror, reflecting all of Raquel's deepest insecurities, her greatest failure. Can you truly love a child who feels like a symbol of what you've lost? Marcos was a ghost himself, a man walking through his life but not truly living in it. He was kind, but his kindness was a distant star. You could see its light, but you could never feel its warmth. He never spoke of his late wife, but her absence was a deafening roar in their marriage. He left Raquel utterly alone to navigate the treacherous waters of stepmotherhood, too absorbed in his work and his own unresolved sorrow to see the storm brewing under his roof. He provided a house, but not a home, a ring, but not a partnership. If a man never lets go of the past, is he not also responsible for the future he destroys? He saw a wife and a daughter, but he never saw the war being waged between them. This profound isolation curdled Raquel's hope into resentment. The whispered thought, "You are not enough," became her daily mantra. It was a poison she drank every morning. She began to see malice in Sofia's childish mistakes, manipulation in her tears. A spilled glass of milk wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act of defiance. Her forgotten chore was a personal attack. She had to believe this because the alternative was too painful to bear, that she was simply incapable of being loved by this man, in this house. Her cruelty wasn't born of strength, but of a desperate, pathetic weakness. It was the lashing out of a drowning woman, pulling down the one person smaller than her. To justify the coldness that had taken root in her heart, she began to build a case against a 7-year-old girl. She would report Sofia's transgressions to Marcos with a weary sigh, painting herself as the patient, long-suffering victim of a difficult child. "She doesn't listen," she'd say. "She's so moody." Just like she would let the sentence hang, allowing Marcos to fill in the blank with his own guilt. She wasn't just lying to him, she was meticulously lying to herself, because if Sofia was the problem, then Raquel wasn't a monster. She was just a woman trying her best. Have you ever seen someone break another person just to feel whole themselves? And so the rejection of Sofia was also Raquel's own self-destruction. In her obsessive battle against a memory, she sacrificed a living, breathing child's heart. She thought that by pushing Sofia away, by locking her in the dark, she could finally extinguish the ghost of the past. But she was wrong. All she did was create a new one. The quiet, terrified little girl in the locked room was a ghost of Raquel's own making, a spectre of her own cruelty that would one day return to haunt her. In trying to escape the pain of being second, she ensured she would spend the rest of her life in first place for regret. The lock on her door was never turned during the day. It was an unlocked cage, a psychological prison whose bars were made of fear. Sofia learned to live within its invisible confines, her world shrinking to the four walls of her room and the silent, treacherous hallways of the house. Mornings were the worst. There was no gentle wake-up, no smell of breakfast cooking for her. There was only the cold, grey light filtering through the window and the heavy silence of a home that held no love for her. She would lie still, listening, trying to gauge Raquel's mood from the sound of her footsteps. A heavy, deliberate tread meant danger. A lighter step meant a fragile, temporary peace. Every day began with this calculation of survival. She ate alone, always. A bowl of plain oatmeal or a piece of dry toast would be left for her on the corner of the vast, cold kitchen counter. She would sit on a tall stool, her small feet dangling far from the floor, and eat in complete silence. The only sounds were the scrape of her spoon against the ceramic and the distant, muffled murmur of her father and Raquel sharing coffee in the living room, their soft laughter a world away. She was a ghost in her own home, a peripheral figure whose basic needs were met with the same detached duty one might afford a stray animal. Would you have been able to swallow your food with a knot of loneliness that tight in your stomach? After her solitary meal, the chores began. Her small hands, chapped and red, would scrub floors until the chemical smell made her dizzy. She would drag laundry baskets that were heavier than she was, her arms aching with a deep, burning strain. Raquel would inspect her work with a critical eye, always finding a flaw, a missed spot, a wrinkled shirt. There was never a word of praise, only a dissatisfied sigh or a sharp comment that chipped away at what little confidence Sofia had left. She worked not for approval, which she knew was impossible to earn, but to avoid punishment. Her childhood was not a time of play, but of relentless, thankless labor that exhausted her small body and weary soul. To survive, Sophia learned the art of invisibility. She memorized the creaks in the floorboards, the rhythm of Raquel's movements through the house. She became a master of silence, holding her breath when her stepmother passed, flattening herself against walls in shadowy hallways. She wanted to shrink, to fold into herself until she was nothing but a speck of dust, too small to be noticed, too insignificant to be hurt. The constant, humming anxiety was a physical presence inside her, a coiled snake in her stomach, always ready to strike. It was the crushing weight of knowing her very existence was an annoyance to the person who should have been her protector. Have you ever felt so small, you wished you could just disappear entirely? The hunger in her stomach was a dull, constant ache, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing emptiness in her heart. She was starved for affection, for a kind word, a gentle touch, a single moment of warmth. She would watch families on television, her eyes wide with a painful longing as she saw mothers hugging their children, fathers lifting them onto their shoulders. She would wrap her own thin arms around her small frame, trying to imagine what it felt like, trying to remember the feeling of her own mother's embrace. The memory was fading, like an old photograph left in the sun, and the thought of losing it completely was a terror worse than any punishment Raquel could devise. How long can a child survive without a single hug? Her only sanctuary was a small, dusty box hidden under her bed. Inside were the things that had belonged to her mother, a few worn paperback novels, a faded silk scarf that still held a ghost of her perfume, and a small music box that no longer played. Sophia would trace the underlined passages in the books, her finger following the path her mother's had taken years ago. These were not just objects. They were proof that she had once been loved, that she was not born from nothingness. She would press the cool silk of the scarf to her cheek, close her eyes, and pretend. In these stolen moments, surrounded by the relics of a forgotten love, she could almost feel whole again. But the real world always intruded. Raquel's voice became the soundtrack to Sophia's life, and soon it became her own inner voice. When she tripped on the rug, the first thought in her head wasn't "I fell at this," but Raquel's sharp hiss, "Clumsy, you break everything you touch." When she struggled with a chore, her own mind whispered, "Useless, you can't do anything right." The poison had seeped in so deep that she no longer needed her tormentor to be present. She carried the cruelty inside her, becoming her own harshest critic, her own jailer. She had fully absorbed the lie that she was inherently bad, a defective child who deserved her lonely fate. Is there anything more tragic than a child who learns to hate herself? Sleep offered no escape. Her nights were plagued by recurring nightmares, where she was running through an endless, dark house, calling for her father, but he couldn't hear her. In another, she would see her mother's face, smiling and beautiful. But when Sophia reached for her, she would dissolve into a cloud of dust. She would wake up with a silent scream caught in her throat, her small body drenched in a cold sweat, the profound loneliness of the dream clinging to her like a shroud. The terror of the day simply followed her into the darkness, ensuring there was never a moment of peace, never a true reprieve from the fear that consumed her waking and sleeping hours. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would press her ear against the thin wall that separated her room from the neighbor's apartment. She could hear the faint, melancholic notes of an old piano being played. The music was sad, but it was beautiful. And it was the only sound in her life that wasn't filled with anger or indifference. It was a lifeline in the dark, a quiet conversation she had with a stranger she had never met. She would lie there, listening, and for a few precious minutes she felt a little less alone in the universe. If you heard that lonely sound through your wall, night after night, what would you have done? She stopped asking why. The question was a door to a pain too vast to comprehend. Instead, she began to believe it was simply the way of the world. Some children had mothers who loved them, and some, like her, did not. She accepted her fate with the quiet resignation of a prisoner on a life sentence. One evening, clutching the faded scarf that smelled of a memory, she curled into a tight ball on the cold floor. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up long ago, leaving behind a hollow ache. She simply lay there, a small, forgotten thing in a house devoid of warmth. her spirit worn thin, almost translucent. This was her life now, a long, silent scream for a love she was convinced she would never deserve. She was a ship lost in a starless sea, with no lighthouse to guide her, and no memory of a safe harbor. Her childhood was not being stolen. It was being meticulously erased, day by day, silence by silence, until she feared nothing would be left of the little girl she once was. She believed she was broken beyond repair, a shattered teacup that could never be put back together. But can a soul truly break when it's only 7 years old? Or is there, somewhere in the deepest, most protected part of the heart, a flicker of light that can never be extinguished? The night that changed everything began with a sound she didn't make. It was the low, urgent murmur of a phone call, followed by the heavy tread of her father's footsteps, faster and harder than she had ever heard them. The air in the house, usually thick with a stagnant silence, suddenly crackled with a new, terrifying energy. Sophia pressed herself into the corner of her room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, expecting Raquel's fury. But the voice that finally broke the silence was her father's, a low, guttural sound of disbelief and dawning horror. For the first time, the storm wasn't for her, but it was about her. She had been a ghost for so long she had forgotten she could be seen. Her bedroom door didn't just unlock, it was thrown open. Standing in the doorway was her father, Marcos, but he looked like a stranger. His face, usually a mask of detached calm, was shattered with an emotion she couldn't name, a mix of agony and shame. He didn't speak. He simply crossed the room, knelt before her, and wrapped her in a thick, warm blanket. The touch was so foreign, so unexpected, that her entire body went rigid. He gently lifted her into his arms, and as he carried her out of the room, she saw Raquel's face in the hallway, pale and twisted with a rage that had finally been defeated. What would you feel, leaving the only home you've ever known, even if it was a cage? The night air was a shock, cold and sharp against her skin, filled with the scent of damp earth and freedom. She buried her face in her father's shoulder, the rough wool of his coat scratching her cheek. He held her tight, his movements swift and resolute as he carried her to the apartment next door. The world she had only ever heard through a thin wall was now before her. The door opened, and a river of warm yellow light spilled into the dark hallway. An old man with kind, wrinkled eyes and a soft smile stood there, waiting. He didn't say a word to her, only nodded at her father, a silent understanding passing between them. This was Elias. This was the man who had heard her. His home was the opposite of hers in every way. It wasn't a house, it was a sanctuary, smelling of old books, lemon tea, and the rich scent of polished wood. Stacks of sheet music leaned against every surface, and a grand, dark piano stood in the center of the room like a sleeping giant. Elias didn't hover or ask questions. He simply placed a warm glass of milk in her trembling hands and sat down in a worn armchair, creating a space of quiet safety. For the first time in years, Sophia could breathe without the fear of taking up too much air. She was in a room where silence wasn't a punishment, but a peaceful invitation to simply be. After a long, comfortable silence, Elias gestured toward the piano. "She has a lot to say," he said softly, not to Sophia, but to the instrument itself. Fear shot through her. She was the girl who broke things, who made bad noises. She shook her head, her eyes wide with panic, but Elias simply smiled. "There are no mistakes here, little one," he whispered. "Only expression." He sat on the bench and played a few gentle, melancholic chords, the same sad, beautiful music she had heard through the wall. It was the sound of her own loneliness, given a voice. Sometimes, all a child needs is for someone to say, "I believe in you." Who was that person for you? Hesitantly, she slid onto the bench beside him. Her hands felt clumsy, alien. Her entire life, she had been taught to be silent, to be small, to not make a mess. But Elias's quiet confidence was a permission slip she had never been given. Trembling, she lifted one small finger and pressed down on a single, white key. A clear, perfect note rang out, hanging in the warm air of the room. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a bad noise. It was a sound she had made. A piece of her that was suddenly real and beautiful. In that one note, the silence of her childhood finally broke, and the first seed of a new life was planted. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, give it a like, and share it with someone who needs to see that even after the darkest night, a new dawn is possible. The music, once a sanctuary, was becoming a cage. With every lesson, Elias's kind eyes would shine with a pride that felt heavier than any of Raquel's insults. He saw a prodigy, a natural talent waiting to bloom, but Sophia saw the same clumsy girl who broke teacups. When he suggested she play in a small student recital, a knot of pure ice formed in her stomach. She wanted to say no, to retreat back into the safe silence of their lessons, but she couldn't bear to see the light in his eyes dim, so she nodded, a silent lie. The piano was no longer her voice. It was a stage, and she was terrified of the silence that would follow if she made a single bad noise. Her father, hearing the news, decided to be a father. He arrived one afternoon not with a question or a hug, but with a large, glossy box. Inside was a dress, a confection of white lace and satin ribbons, more suited for a doll than for her. He smiled, a strained, hopeful expression. "For the big star," he said. Sophia felt the air leave her lungs. The dress was a costume for a girl she would never be, a happy, perfect daughter. It wasn't a gift of love. It was a uniform of his expectations, a heavy shroud of his guilt. She looked at the price tag he'd forgotten to remove and felt the old, familiar weight of being a burden, an expensive problem to be solved. That night, sleep was a distant country. The white dress hung on her closet door, a luminous ghost in the darkness, mocking her. Raquel's voice, a venomous whisper she thought she had escaped, slithered back into her thoughts. "You are a constant reminder of what I can never have." The words twisted into a new shape. "You are not good enough. You will never be good enough." She looked at her own hands, the hands that Elias called gifted, and saw only instruments of failure. The recital wasn't an opportunity, it was a trial, and she was already guilty. Have you ever felt your greatest strength suddenly feel like your biggest weakness? The fear of disappointing Elias was a terror far worse than any locked door. On stage, the single spotlight was not warm. It was an interrogation lamp, pinning her to the piano bench. The audience was a sea of dark, silent shapes, but in her mind, every face was Raquel's, her lips curled in a knowing sneer. She saw her father in the front row, his posture rigid with hope, clutching a program. It was too much. Her fingers, which flew across the keys in the safety of Elias's living room, were now cold, clumsy strangers. She took a breath, tried to begin, but her mind was a blizzard of white noise. A single, discordant note clanged into the hall, ugly and alone. Then, nothing. Just the crushing, absolute silence of her own failure. The silence that followed was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the air. Identical to the silence in Raquel's kitchen, she could hear someone cough, the rustle of a program, sounds that magnified her humiliation into a roar. Tears blurred the white and black of the keys into a meaningless grey stripe. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She had proven them all right. She was the girl who broke things. She couldn't even create a simple melody without shattering it. Without looking up, she fled the stage, the sound of her own ragged breathing, the only applause she would receive that night. Back in the quiet apartment, she tore the white dress from her body, the sound of ripping fabric a small, satisfying violence. She threw it in a heap in the corner and locked her bedroom door, recreating the prison of her childhood. She curled into a ball on the floor, the familiar cold of the wood a perverse comfort. The hope Elias had ignited in her now felt like the cruelest lie. It was a brief, beautiful flame that had only served to show her how deep the darkness truly was. Why did she ever let herself believe she could be anything more than what Raquel had named her? Has a past failure ever made you want to give up completely on your future? Elias did not knock. He did not call her name. Instead, after a long silence, he began to play the piano. It wasn't a perfect, polished piece. It was halting, sorrowful, and full of dissonant chords that hung in the air like unanswered questions. It was a melody of profound sadness, a song that stumbled and fell, yet continued on. He was not playing for an audience. He was speaking to her through the wall, in the only language that could reach her now. He was playing the sound of failure, of imperfection, of trying again anyway. He was telling her, without words, that he was not disappointed. He was simply waiting. The broken notes seeped through the door and wrapped around her. They were the sound of her own shattered heart, given voice and dignity. The music didn't demand perfection, it acknowledged pain. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard. Slowly, as if pulled by an invisible string, Sophia uncurled. She rose from the floor, her limbs stiff, and walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she turned the lock. In the soft light of the living room, Talia sat at the piano, his eyes closed, his gnarled fingers coaxing truth from the keys. He didn't stop playing when he heard her. He just tilted his head, acknowledging the empty space on the bench beside him. For a long moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, a ghost between two worlds. The past screamed at her to run, to hide, to accept her worthlessness, but the music whispered a different story. It was a story of resilience. With a shuddering breath that was half sob, half defiance, she walked to the piano. She sat beside the old man. Her hands were shaking, but she lifted them to the keys. She didn't try to play her recital piece. Instead, she added one clear, high note to his melancholy song. It was a fragile sound, a tiny flicker of light in a vast darkness, but it was hers. She had fallen, but something inside her refused to stay on the ground. 10 years can transform a ghost into a queen. The hushed reverence of the conservatory hall was a universe away from the suffocating silence of her childhood room. Sophia stood in the wings, no longer a girl of 7 but a young woman of 17, her posture radiating a quiet power that seemed to draw the very light toward her. The heavy velvet curtain was a barrier between who she was and who she was about to become for the 1,000 strangers holding their breath. She smoothed the simple black fabric of her dress, her hands steady. She was not afraid of the silence anymore. She had learned to fill it, to command it, to make it her own. The stage was not a place of judgment. It was her sanctuary. In the third row, Marcos clutched the concert program so tightly the glossy paper crinkled in his fist. His heart hammered against his ribs with a nervous rhythm that was part pride, part terror. Then she walked onto the stage. The fragile, haunted child he carried from a dark room a decade ago was gone. In her place stood this poised woman, serene and self-possessed, who moved not with fear, but with purpose. A tidal wave of regret, so powerful it stole his breath, crashed over him. He had watched her grow from a distance, funding her lessons, attending her recitals, but he had never truly seen her. Not like this. He was looking at a masterpiece he had almost allowed to be destroyed. Sophia sat at the grand piano, its polished black surface reflecting her calm face like a still dark lake. She took a moment, letting the silence of the hall settle, breathing it in. Her fingers, long and elegant, hovered over the keys. Then she began. The first notes were not a grand announcement, but a quiet, dissonant whisper. They were fragmented, uncertain, stumbling in the dark. It was the sound of loneliness itself, the melody of a child curled on a cold floor, believing she was a mistake. It was the theme of a house without love, a sound that traveled through time and landed directly in Marcos's chest, a precise and agonizing strike. He recognized the feeling instantly. It was the sound of his own failure. The music told a story. It built into a frantic, anxious rhythm, the sound of small feet tiptoeing on creaky floorboards, of held breath in a silent hallway. The left hand played a heavy, oppressive bass line, a constant, menacing presence, while the right hand fluttered with a desperate, childlike melody that never quite found its resolution. It was a musical portrait of fear. The audience was captivated by the raw, technical brilliance, but Marcos was suffocating. This wasn't a performance. It was an excavation. She was unearthing the ghosts he had tried so desperately to keep buried, forcing him to listen to every moment of the suffering he had been willfully blind to. He was hearing her silent screams, 10 years too late. Then a shift. A single, clear theme emerged from the chaos, a simple, hopeful melody that felt like a sliver of light under a locked door. It was the sound of kindness, of a warm glass of milk, of an old man's patient voice saying, "There are no mistakes here." The music began to heal itself. The dissonant chords resolved into harmony. The frantic rhythm slowed into a steady, confident heartbeat. The melody of hope grew stronger, weaving through the darker themes, not erasing them, but transforming them. Marcos felt a tear slide down his cheek, a hot track of shame and a profound, aching gratitude for Elias, the neighbor who had been more of a father than he ever was. The piece surged toward its climax. The themes of pain and hope collided, not in battle, but in a breathtaking synthesis. It became a storm of breathtaking power, a declaration of resilience. This was no longer the music of a victim. It was the anthem of a survivor. Sophia's entire being was poured into the performance, her body swaying, her face a mask of intense concentration and cathartic release. She was not just playing notes, she was testifying. She was taking the ugliest fragments of her past, the neglect, the cruelty, the loneliness, and forging them into something overwhelmingly beautiful, something undeniably strong. She was showing the world, and herself, that she was not broken. The final chord hung in the air, a note of triumphant resolution that vibrated through the very bones of the hall before fading into a perfect, profound silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, the applause erupted, a deafening, roaring wave of admiration. People were on their feet, their faces alight with emotion, but Marcos remained seated, frozen. He couldn't clap. His hands were limp in his lap, his body racked with silent, gut-wrenching sobs. The applause was for the artist. His tears were for the child he had failed. He finally understood the depth of her pain and the sheer miraculous force of her will to survive it. Sophia stood and took her bow, her expression serene, almost peaceful, as the applause washed over her. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not with triumph but with a quiet grace. For a fleeting second, her gaze met her father's. She saw his tear-streaked face, his shattered expression. In her eyes, there was no anger, no accusation, not even a flicker of the old fear. There was only a calm, knowing clarity. She saw him not as the father who had abandoned her, but as a man trapped in his own regret. In that single, silent exchange, the last chain of the past broke. She was free. Who holds the power when one person has moved on and the other is still trapped in their mistake? As she walked off the stage to the thunderous ovation, she left him there in the velvet darkness. The concert had not been an act of revenge or a plea for his apology. It was her declaration of independence. She had taken the poison Raquel had fed her and the silence her father had offered and had spun them into gold. It was a beauty created not for his redemption, but for her own. She had found her own love, her own worth, in the space between 88 keys. He had finally woken up to see the daughter he had, but she no longer needed him to see her at all. Backstage, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and wilting roses. The thunderous applause was a distant echo now, replaced by the quiet hum of the building. Sophia sat on a worn stool, her fingers resting lightly on her knees, her breathing slow and even. The storm had passed. She felt not triumphant, but profoundly calm, as if she had finally set down a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. The door creaked open, and her father stood there, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. He didn't look like the confident man who sat in the front row. He looked like a ghost, his face pale and hollowed by a decade of unspoken words. He took a hesitant step inside, the space between them charged with the gravity of a lifetime. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Words were inadequate for the chasm he had allowed to form between them. Instead, he simply held out a single, perfect white rose, his hand trembling. Sophia looked from the flower to his face, and for the first time, she saw past her own pain and into the depths of his. She saw a man drowning in a regret so vast it had become his entire world. She took the rose, her fingers brushing his. The touch was electric, a bridge across years of silence. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, the two words cracking under an unbearable weight. "I was blind." Sophia simply nodded, a gesture of acceptance, not of absolution. Her forgiveness wasn't a gift for him. It was the final act of her own liberation. Would you have been able to forgive, not for them, but for yourself? The apartment was just as Elias had left it, filled with the quiet dignity of books and music. After his passing, he had left it to her, not just the space, but the legacy. The grand piano stood in the center of the room, no longer a sleeping giant, but a trusted friend. Sophia would often sit there, not playing grand concertos, but simple, quiet melodies that felt like conversations with her old mentor. She had honored his memory by becoming the artist he knew she could be, but she felt a deeper calling. The stage was fulfilling, the applause was validating, but the silence of the apartment reminded her of another silence, from another time. It reminded her of the little girl who listened through a wall, desperate for a kind sound. Her pain had been transformed into art, but she knew art alone wasn't enough. She wanted to transform it into sanctuary. Using the inheritance from Elias and the concert earnings her father quietly provided, she did something radical. She didn't move to a grander home. She turned the old apartment into one, the Elias House, a small free music school for children who came from silence and sorrow. Children who, like her, had been told they were a mistake, that they made bad noises. The front door, once her portal to safety, was now always unlocked, a silent invitation for any child who needed to find their voice. Is this the true meaning of strength? Turning the weapon that hurt you into a tool that heals others? One afternoon, a small girl with wide, terrified eyes stood frozen before the piano, her hands clenched at her sides. "I'll break it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words were a perfect echo of Sophia's own past. A ghost she was no longer afraid to face. Sophia knelt beside her, not as a teacher, but as a fellow survivor. She didn't touch the girl, but gently placed her own hands on the keys. "It's okay," Sophia said, her voice the same soft, steady tone Elias had used with her. "Here," she whispered, looking not at the keys, but into the child's soul. "There are no mistakes, only expression." The little girl's shoulders relaxed, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. A flicker of hope had been passed on. Sophia had been defined by a locked door. Now, her life was an open one. Her father visited sometimes, not for grand reconciliations, but for quiet cups of tea, their relationship being rebuilt one fragile, honest note at a time. He was a part of her life, but not its center. Her center was the music, the children, the beautiful, healing noise that now filled every corner of the home that saved her. She had taken the worst of her life, the rejection, the loneliness, the crushing belief that she was worthless, and built a legacy of belonging from its ruins. She was rejected by the one who should have loved her, but was embraced by the world. What does that tell you about where true family is found?